الله وبه نستعين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. The history and study of Hadith is, in Arabic, you say ilmun sharif. It's a noble science. It's a noble science. And it's a science that the more you study and the more you know, the more you respect. And it's very easy to mock or insult from afar, from a place of ignorance. But the closer you get and the more entwined in the science you get, the more you're forced to respect it, I think. And a lot of times Muslims, when they want to hear about Hadith, they want sort of a cheerleader who's going to tell them that Hadith science is wonderful and everything we know about Hadith is true, and it gives us everything is authentic, and everything we think we know about the Prophet is correct. And that's not what I think real Hadith scholars do, because science of Hadith is not something that needs to be cheerleaded. It's an amazing accomplishment that I think stands as one of the most impressive intellectual feats and edifices in human history. I mean, it stands up there with sort of the Greek peripatetic philosophical tradition and Chinese philosophy. I mean, it's that ingenious, I think, and it's that vast a field. I mean, literally, volumes and volumes and volumes, rooms upon rooms of books have been written on the science of trying to transmit and authenticate reports from the Prophet. So, this is a science, this is a working science. This is a working science. It's a real science. It's not something that needs to be praised to make people feel good. It's something that should be studied and understood as something that is working today. People today are still studying the Prophet's legacy and trying to figure out what he said, what he didn't say, and how reliable certain statements are and what we should do with them. So today I'm going to briefly talk about the history of the collection of hadiths, the collection of transmissions of hadiths. Everyone here knows what a hadith is? Everyone know what a hadith is? Great. It's a report about something the Prophet said or did, right? And then I'm going to talk about the criticism of hadith, how Muslim scholars have tried to verify if something that the Prophet supposedly said is in fact something that he really said or did, or is a false attribution, either by mistake or intentionally. And finally, I'm going to talk about some of the criticisms that Western scholars of Islam have leveled against the hadith tradition. And then discuss them and see if they're valid or not, and what responses Muslim scholars have made, and what responses Western scholars have made to these criticisms of the hadith tradition. So that'll be the last part of the talk. Okay, history of hadith criticism. If you guys could think of one question that drives all of Islamic intellectual history, what is that question? There's one question that Muslims are trying to answer from the very beginning, from the moment the Prophet died, peace be upon him, until today. There's one question that has driven Muslims. Does anyone have any idea what it might be? That's a good question. It's a branch of the bigger question. But the bigger question is, how do we live as Muslims? How do we understand our religion? What does God want from us? And how do we perform those acts and believe what He wants us to believe? Right? How did the Prophet live Islam? How do we know that? This is the single biggest question. That's the driving factor in Islamic intellectual history, and it's behind everything from the very moment the community is created. The Muslim community is created. So you can imagine that when the Prophet died, peace be upon him, a lot of his companions kind of preserved his teachings, both in their behavior, in their minds, in their hearts, as we preserve things we learn from our parents or from our advisors and things like that. And some of them wrote down material that he had said. We know that some companions of the Prophet, like Abdullah bin Amr bin al-As, Abu Huraira, later on in his life, had written collections of reports from the Prophet. Things that they sat down and studiously tried to write out all those things they had heard the Prophet say, dealing with any issues from legal to doctrinal to ethical. And some companions, like Abu Huraira, like Ibn Abbas, not only wrote down what they had heard from the Prophet, but more specifically wrote down what they heard from other companions of the Prophet. So when someone says, for example, Abu Huraira transmitted 5,000 400 hadiths. How could any one person, who only knew the Prophet for 3 years, how could, in a period of 3 years, anybody hear 5,400 statements from somebody? It's because he didn't hear them all from the Prophet, right? He heard them from other companions, and he wrote them down, or had them written down later on in his life. Well, so you can think of early hadith writing as basically being a transcript of early legal discourse. So we can imagine that you're in the city of Basra, and it's the year 720, okay? And you're sitting there, and there's this very respected old man sitting under a reed kind of awning on a mat. People are coming to him and asking him questions. His name's Hassan al-Basri. He's the son of one of the maids of one of the Prophet's wives, Salama, and he has memorized through things he's heard from his mother and from other companions that he met, companions of the Prophet and other prominent Muslims in Basra, has memorized things that the Prophet said and did. He's also memorized things that his teachers told him were the correct ways to live as a Muslim. So, for example, how do I divide up my inheritance if my parents die? How do I handle something that my wife says as a criticism of me? How do I mediate these issues with her, right? And so the factors that go into his answers to those questions, so Hassan al-Basri's answers can be anything from something that the Prophet said that he had heard from his, let's say, his teacher, or from his mother, right? Or from Ali ibn Abi Talib, for example. Or it can be something that he's heard from another member of the Muslim community who heard it from the Prophet. Or it can be from something that he himself is just knows to be the right way to live as a Muslim. So someone can come and say, "Oh, Al-Hassan al-Basri, how many rakahs do I pray in Dhuhr?" You can say 4 rakahs. And that's his response. So you can imagine somebody sitting there in Basra and writing down on a piece of parchment or papyrus Al-Hassan al-Basri's answers. And he can divide these up into issues. He says, prayer. Thing under prayer. How many times a day do you pray? When do you pray? Wudu, tahara. When do you make wudu? Why do you have to make wudu? How do you make wudu? Marriage, divorce, capital punishment, corporal punishment, everything like that, right? And in these chapters, he's going to write down everything that he hears from Hassan al-Basri, which might be hadiths from the Prophet. It might be Hassan al-Basri's own personal opinion, right? It might be Al-Hassan invoking a verse from the Quran and commenting on it. So in some ways, these early hadith writing is a transcript of legal discourse at the time. And these early books were called musannaf, or a book divided into categories, topical categories. Now the earliest, of course, the companions were writing this stuff even during the life of the Prophet, but the earliest book that survived, that we know existed, comes from about 150 from a scholar named Ibn Jurayj, who died in 150 in Mecca, or 767 of the Common Era. So he had his musannaf, where he is basically setting down all the legal material he can come across, be it from the Prophet, be it from prominent companions, be it from prominent successors, in a topical format. Okay. Now what happens is, about 50 years after Ibn Jurayj dies, so the beginning of the beginning of the 200s Hijri, the early 9th century, the Christian calendar, people start saying, why don't I start organizing this material, this legal material I have, along the lines of attribution of the Prophet. So I have all these different sources sources of authority for how to live as a Muslim. I have Hassan al-Basri, I have companions, I have the Prophet, I have Quranic verses, everything. I'm just going to have reports that go back to the Prophet. And in order to verify that the Prophet said these things, because obviously the Prophet is a hugely authoritative figure, and in the early period of Islam, if you want to advance a sectarian or political or legal agenda, the easiest way to make people agree with you is to say, well, the Prophet said this. So if you think your cousin should be the caliph, you say, well, the Prophet said that my cousin is a righteous leader and will guide the Muslim community to straight path. So how do we try and verify that the Prophet said this? Well, we're going to have our chain of transmission back to the Prophet. So we find books that are called musnads, or books based on prophetic transmissions